Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby and today I'm going to be doing more horror book recommendations. This is something I've been requested to do for quite some time now, and I don't think I've done the last horror book recommendations since like June last year, so I'll link the first round of horror book recommendations if you missed those. It was a fun time. But now I'm back with some more horror book recommendations because I've been reading a lot of horror within the last year. I kind of touched on this in the last video, but in the year of 2020 I got really into horror books for like the first time ever. So in the year of 2020 I read more horror books than I ever have in my life, and I'm starting to continue that trend into 2021. I've read a few good horror books already this year. I thought it would be the perfect time to do another horror book recommendations video if you're looking for some more horror books in your life. Yeah, I'm very excited to get to the recs. Before we do, I wanted to say a huge thank you to today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. No matter what 2021 brings you, you can spend it creating something meaningful with Skillshare's online classes because time is what we make of it. It's curated specifically for learning, meaning that there are no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so that you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. And it's less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. I recently just started taking this class called Writing Fiction, 5 Exercises to Craft a Compelling Plot. And it's really cool because this class is taught by the author Lisa Ko, who I have a great deal of respect for. I have one of her books on my TBR and I haven't gotten to it yet. But I was so excited when I discovered this class because, you know, I'm kind of a huge fan of Skillshare's creative writing classes. I just think they're really great and they always inspire me to want to write. But again, if this class doesn't interest you, they do offer tons of classes in different creative subjects like photography, illustration, marketing, web design, you name it, it's probably there. So for a limited time, please use the link in my description to get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership so that you can explore your creativity. And thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel and the booktube community. Alright, now without further ado, let's get into the horror recs. Ooh, there's some horrors in this house. There's some horrors in this house. All right, the very first one that I need to recommend is probably my favorite horror book that I read in the year of 2020. I said 2020. It's not 2020 anymore. The first recommendation is probably going to be my favorite horror book that I read in the year of 2021 so far, and that is The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. Oh my gosh, this was my first book by this author, and it will certainly not be my last, because after reading this book, I need to pick up every single book this author has published. This author actually does have a new book publishing in the month of April, and I am so excited to get to it. But anyways, this book, what is it about? This book has major Pet Sematary vibes. Can I just say that? Like, this book reminded me so much of Pet Sematary in like the best way possible. And this is kind of a horror novel that takes place in this small town. You know, we're following it in two different points of views and timelines. So in one timeline, we're actually following in a historical timeline in the past in like 1908, like way in the past. And then we follow a present day timeline that takes place in the same small town. And basically what's happening is these people are going missing in this small town. And then like we're trying to figure out what happened to these people. And I loved following in both timelines. I found both timelines to be really compelling, really interesting. And I just thought it was so spooky, and like the atmosphere, it's very like, you know, out in the woods kind of like atmosphere. It's very like winter vibes. It's perfect for that time of year. But honestly, you could enjoy this book any time of year. Like, there is some imagery in this book that I will never get out of my head that was just really, really creepy and really scary, and it involved children and closets. And if you've read this scene, then you know what I'm talking about. Next horror recommendation is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. And this is one that I actually wish I had gotten on board with sooner, because a lot of people really hyped this book and it had just taken me so long to get to this one. But I'm actually really glad I read it when I did, because I read it right around Halloween time, and that is the perfect time to read Kill Creek. Because if you didn't know anything about this book, it follows these 4 authors who are all really well-known horror authors, and they all write these really well-known horror books, and they all get invited to spend the night on Halloween night into Kill Creek, which is this haunted house in America. It's like one of the most well-known haunted houses in America, and they're all gonna stay the night there on Halloween night, and it's gonna get live streamed to the public. Like, how much fun of a book premise is this? I really loved it. There's only one female author out of these 4 horror authors, and I loved her so much. She was just so great to read about, and she did not take any shit from the men, and I just aspired to be like her, honestly. And I love how this book kind of talks about horror books and horror writing as a culture, and kind of like dissects more like what scares people. And the conversation in this book is just really, really interesting, you know, because we're following 4 horror authors. There's just a lot of discussion that goes into like how we write horror books and different things like that. I just found it all to be very interesting, and the ending freaking had me shook. All right, my next horror recommendation is going to be The Bright Lands by John Fram. This is like Stephen King but make it gay, and not only that, but its own voices, because John Fram is a gay man and he's writing about a gay character, and it's just it's so great. This book takes place in a conservative small town in Texas, and we're following this guy Joel who has to come back to this small town. He lives in New York, but he has to come back because his younger brother goes missing, and his younger brother is on the football team, and there's all this suspicion around like what happened to his brother, what's going on. I will warn you, this book does have a lot of characters, so I would recommend like maybe taking some notes on who is who, because you pretty much get introduced to the entire football team, and all of them have something like some kind of storyline involved in this book. So it's a lot of characters, but it's also just so like the atmosphere in this book is so like small town murder mystery vibes. Like I just love it so much. The next book I wanted to recommend is The Patient by Jasper DeWitt, and this is probably the horror novel that made me the most scared out of all of these horror novels on this list, because this book just follows this young patient who's at this insane asylum, and we kind of follow this young boy from the time that he's a young boy and he's getting admitted to this hospital all the way through the rest of his life, I guess, or at least like into his adulthood. My god, it's something about, I guess, like creepy demonic type of children, you know, that really scares me. But I was literally reading this book in the dark and I got so freaked out that I had to stop reading it because I just couldn't deal with it. It was freaking me out so much. I don't know what it was about this book, but I loved it so much. And there are some things in this book that I will never forget and that still give me like goosebumps to this day. Like it was just so well done, so creepy. Definitely one of the best horror novels that I've ever read. Another horror novel that I really loved that really surprised me is Brother by Anaya Alborn. I think this one really surprised me because I had literally no expectations going into it, and I actually read this book because of you guys. I read this for my reading your horror recommendations video that I did last October. I can link it down below if you didn't see that one. But it was a super fun time doing that video because I found some gems like this book and Kill Creek I read in that video. Oh my gosh. This book is so interesting because we follow this family of like hillbillies that live out on this farm, and they're also murderers, and they like lure these women to their freaking cabin in the woods, and then they kill these women. And in this book we're following their youngest son Michael, and he doesn't know if he feels right about what his family is doing. And oh my god, this family was so interesting to read about, but this story is just also very intense. Like the beginning is kind of a slow start, I will admit, but once you get hooked, oh my god, like there's so much action at the end of this book. I was just like on the edge of my seat the whole time. And then I also have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This one's really fun too because it feels like an 80s like summer horror movie because we're mostly taking place in the 80s. And we follow these two young high school girls, Abby and Gretchen, and we kind of follow like their friendship from when they're like really little girls until like they're in high school. And this book was just so intense, and I feel like because it takes place in the 80s and it follows these two young girls, this book has a lot of social commentary about how people didn't believe women when they would come forward with certain things, or when they had certain fears, like nobody would believe them. The idea of your best friend, you know, getting freaking possessed is like really scary. And there's this one scene in this book that truly traumatized me, like one of the scariest things I've ever read since The Troop. It was very like body horror like that, and it was just, it was so disgusting, but like in the best way, you know? Like I'll never forget that scene. I also have Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. This one is a novella. It's actually pretty short. It's only about like 130-ish pages, but this one's actually really interesting and really unique for a horror novel because it's about this young guy Sawyer who is in high school, and he decides, like him and his friends decide to bring this mannequin that they found in the woods. They decide to bring it into a movie theater to like scare one of their friends who works at the movie theater, and then when they're at the movie theater, the mannequin just gets up and walks the fuck out of the movie theater, and they're all like, bitch, what? And this is, I mean, I don't want to say any more than that because it's such a short book, so there is not a lot of time for surprises in this, but oh my god, this book was just so strange, so unique. The writing was really interesting. Like I will admit, some of the writing towards the end wasn't my absolute favorite, but the concept of this book was really, really interesting, really cool. Another recent horror book that I really enjoyed that I actually just read last month in a reading vlog where I read horror books that take place underwater is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This book was shocking because I didn't know if it was going to be my thing because it's kind of like fantasy in a way because it involves killer mermaids. Holy shit. I've never read a book that involves mermaids before, and especially, you know, killer mermaids. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. I didn't know that mermaids would be a thing that I would fear until I read this book. This book was just so well done. Like, if you have a fear of like being underwater, like that claustrophobic, like you don't have any control, oh my gosh, this book is terrifying. And also just the idea of like a mermaid, you know, like I've always imagined mermaids to be like, you know, like the Little Mermaid or like Aquamarine or whatever. Like, no, this is like a mermaid that will fuck you up. It's like a shark basically. Oh my gosh, this book was just so entertaining, and there's so much different representation in this book that I love. Like, they have a deaf character, they have a female-female relationship in this book. Like, there is so much to love about this book, and it's just a really great time. In that video, I also ended up reading The Deep by Nick Cutter, and this one I wouldn't recommend as much as Into the Drowning Deep. And with this one, you know, Nick Cutter also wrote one of my favorite books of all time, The Troop. So I would definitely recommend The Troop over The Deep if you haven't read The Troop yet. But if you have read The Troop and you're craving more of like Nick Cutter's, you know, bizarre writing, I do think you might like The Deep. Like, The Deep wasn't like one of my absolute favorite books ever. It was somewhere around like a 3.5 or 4 star for me, but I still really enjoyed this one. And this one's interesting because it's about this plague that's like taking over the world, and it's a plague that like affects your memory. So these people are like not able to remember like who they are and who their families are. And but this one's interesting because we're following this guy who has a brother who's like 8 miles below the surface of the ocean trying to figure out a cure for this plague that's happening on Earth. There are things down there in the ocean with them, and it's terrifying. And most of this book does take place 8 miles beneath the surface of the ocean, and it's just terrifying. It's really scary. This book is so atmospheric. Like, oh my god, it's just so claustrophobic and scary. I would also recommend Mallory by Josh Malerman. This one is actually a sequel to Bird Box, so you obviously have to read Bird Box first. But I know that some people didn't enjoy this one as much as Bird Box, but I personally enjoyed this book probably just as much or maybe even more than Bird Box. I thought it was a really great sequel, and I like that it takes place nearly like 15 years after Bird Box. Like, it's just really interesting to explore this universe 15 years later. And I just think Mallory was a really fun time, and I was really surprised by this book. And then lastly, I just had a few other recommendations of books that I personally didn't rate super high, but I still think other people might find some interest in these books. One of the ones is Night Shift by Stephen King. This is a collection of short stories from Stephen King, and I think there are so many really good short stories in this book. Not all of them were great, but some of my favorites were Quitters Inc. for sure, The Boogeyman, Graveyard Shift. If you're gonna read any short story from this collection, I think Quitters Inc. is by far the best one. It feels like a Black Mirror episode or something. It's really, really good. And then another short story from Stephen King that I really enjoyed is 1922. This one gave me a major fear of rats that I did not know I had before I read this book. This one isn't one of my favorites from Stephen King, but it's really short and really effective and really creepy. Then I also have A Clown in a Cornfield. The reason why this one isn't like rated higher for me is because I think I went into this one expecting something that it wasn't. But if you're really into slasher books, then I really think you might enjoy this, because I had assumed the clown thing in this book was going to be more of like a paranormal supernatural thing, but it was actually like human beings dressed as clowns killing people, and so it was still scary. It's just not really what I was expecting. But if you're into like slasher stuff, then I think you might really enjoy this one. And then lastly, I have Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And this is one that I ended up rating around the 3.5 stars, but it's still something I would recommend, because if you're looking for something that's more like historical fiction and horror, and this one takes place in Mexico, it's definitely like one of the most unique and interesting horror novels that I've ever read. But I also wasn't a huge fan of like the writing in this book. I found it to be a little bit hard to get into, just because I don't read a lot of historical fiction myself. But also like the ending of this book ended up being just okay for me. It took me a long time to get into it, but there is some really great stuff towards towards the middle of this book that I thought was so creepy and so well done. So if this sounds at all interesting to you, I think this would be a good recommendation. Those are all of the horror book recommendations that I have for you today. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this list. I think there's some really great horror books on this list, and I've just been reading so many great horror books lately. It makes me so excited to like venture out and read even more. So let me know your thoughts if you've read any of these books. Also, please give me any of your horror book recommendations if you have any for me. If you see any books on this list and you're like, hey, that sounds like this book, so you'd probably like this book, then please let me know, because I'm always looking for new horror books to read. And thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I'll see you very soon with a new video.